November 1944. A lone P-38 Lightning sliced through the gray Balkan sky above Yugoslavia, its twin engines humming steadily in the cold air. Inside the cockpit, the American lieutenant glanced at his fuel gauge and felt a tightening in his chest. The needle was falling. Around him, 9 Soviet Yak fighters held a tight formation, their Red Star insignias unmistakable against the dull clouds. His radio crackled with static before a voice broke through. "American aircraft, follow instructions. Land immediately." The lieutenant didn't answer. He already knew what landing meant. Internment. Interrogation. Weeks, maybe months, waiting inside a Soviet base while the war continued without him. His squadron would assume he had been killed somewhere over Yugoslavia. Before the mission, intelligence briefings had assured American pilots that Soviet forces would never fire on Allied aircraft. Up here in the sky, that reassurance felt thin. Below the aircraft, the Adriatic coast stretched westward under a sheet of heavy clouds. The Balkans in late 1944 were a confusing battlefield where alliances existed on paper but rarely matched reality on the ground. American fighter units based in Italy regularly escorted bombers deep into German-controlled territory: Austria, Hungary, Romania. These missions were long and dangerous. Pilots often flew for hours above mountain ranges where thin air strained both engines and nerves. Returning home required navigating narrow air corridors negotiated by diplomats. One wrong turn could place a pilot over territory controlled by German units, Yugoslav partisans, or the advancing Soviet army. Official policy was simple. If an American aircraft landed in Soviet territory, the pilot was expected to comply peacefully and wait for repatriation. But pilots knew the truth. Men who landed inside Soviet zones sometimes vanished into endless paperwork. Requests for their return moved slowly through diplomatic channels. Sometimes they didn't move at all. These pilots became bargaining pieces in political negotiations no one in a cockpit could influence. Stories circulated quietly in ready rooms. Pilots spoke about them in low voices late at night. They talked about men who disappeared into Soviet custody and never returned to their squadrons. On November 7th, the lieutenant had taken off from Foggia airfield in Italy as part of a bomber escort mission. His aircraft, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, was one of the most distinctive fighters in the war. Its twin booms and central cockpit made it instantly recognizable in the sky. The Lightning was fast, powerful, and heavily armed. But it had one serious weakness. It burned fuel quickly. Every escort mission was planned with brutal precision. Pilots calculated fuel consumption down to the minute. There was no margin for mistakes. The lieutenant had flown this route many times. He knew the navigation points, the altitudes, the radio frequencies. Most importantly, he knew to stay west of the city of Niš. But the mission had gone wrong. Heavy flak over the target forced the escort fighters to scatter. Thick cloud cover swallowed entire formations during the return flight. Pilots were forced to navigate home alone. The lieutenant trusted his instruments as the P-38 pushed west through the clouds. At first, the situation seemed manageable. His fuel was lower than expected, but still enough to reach the coast. Then the clouds suddenly broke. Instead of the Adriatic coastline, he saw flat farmland stretching to the horizon. A city appeared in the distance. Smoke drifted above railway yards. He recognized the terrain immediately. The wind had pushed him east. He was over Niš, Soviet territory. He banked sharply west, trying to disappear back into the cloud layer. But it was already too late. Somewhere below, Soviet radar operators had already detected the aircraft. Phones rang. Orders traveled quickly to a nearby airfield. Minutes later, the first Yak fighter appeared off his left wing. Another slipped behind him. Then more. Within seconds, 9 Soviet fighters surrounded the P-38 in a precise intercept formation. They didn't fire. Instead, the lead pilot pointed down toward the ground. "Follow us. Land." The lieutenant shook his head and pointed west. "American." Returning to base, the Yaks tightened their formation. One fighter moved directly ahead of him, forcing him to slow down. Another dropped below his aircraft, blocking any attempt to dive. He was trapped. 9 fighters had sealed every escape direction. The Soviet airfield appeared ahead, a strip of concrete surrounded by hangars. The lieutenant glanced down at his fuel gauge again. Minutes left. If he followed them to that runway, The war would end for him inside a Soviet barracks. Paperwork, interrogations, endless waiting. He remembered something he once told his crew chief. The worst mistake a pilot could make was surrendering his options. As long as the engine still ran, as long as the controls still responded, there was always a choice, even if it was a bad one. And suddenly the lieutenant remembered a strange briefing he had heard 6 weeks earlier. A grounded pilot had described an unusual evasion maneuver, one that sounded almost suicidal. Instead of accelerating away from pursuers, you slowed down, cut the throttle, dropped the flaps, forced the aircraft toward stall. Pursuing fighters would overshoot. Their formation would break apart. And in that moment of chaos, you dove hard. The maneuver had never been used in combat. Most pilots laughed when they heard it. One of them asked what happened if the stall became uncontrollable. The grounded pilot shrugged. Then you die. The lieutenant hadn't laughed. He had taken notes. Now, surrounded by 9 Soviet fighters with almost no fuel left, that impossible idea returned to him. Because sometimes survival depended on doing the one thing nobody expected. The lieutenant studied the fuel gauge again. 8 minutes. Maybe 10 if he leaned the mixture, but leaning the engines meant risking rough performance. And right now he needed every bit of power the Lightning could produce. 10 minutes would never reach the Adriatic. Not even close. The math was simple and merciless. Ahead of him, the lead Yak slowed again, forcing the P-38 to match speed. His airspeed slipped below efficient cruise. Now the engines burned fuel simply to remain in formation. Every passing second erased another option. He briefly considered surrendering, landing, internment versus the alternative. Weeks of captivity or minutes gambling against physics. His hands rested calmly on the controls. He had learned something important about flying under pressure. The body must stay quiet so the mind can work. The memory of that strange briefing returned. Throttle back, drop flaps, force the stall, let them overshoot, then dive. It had sounded insane in a ready room. Up here, surrounded by Soviet fighters, it sounded worse. But the physics still worked. The Yak fighters were faster in a chase and more maneuverable in a turn. But they were also lighter, with less inertia. If he forced a sudden change in speed, their momentum would betray them. The risks were obvious. A stall at low altitude meant death. The P-38's twin engines made things worse. Uneven thrust during a stall could flip the aircraft violently. And if the turbochargers hesitated when he demanded power again, the maneuver would end in a spin. There was also another factor. 9 fighters flying in tight formation. If he slowed suddenly, they wouldn't simply overshoot. They would scatter. 9 different pilots reacting at once. For a few seconds, their perfect formation would collapse into chaos. That was the opening. Not enough to escape immediately, but enough to break the trap. He checked the altitude. 4,200 feet. Barely enough. Below him stretched flat farmland with no mountains or valleys to hide behind. His fuel dropped again. 7 minutes. If the maneuver failed, there would be no recovery. If it worked, he would still have to outrun them with almost empty tanks. The Adriatic lay 40 miles west. At full throttle, that meant roughly 4 minutes of flight. He didn't have 4 minutes. Unless he glided the final distance. Engines silent. No exhaust. No noise. By the time the Soviet pilots realized he was gliding, he might already be over water. He could ditch near the coast. Swim ashore. Survive. It wasn't a plan. It was a chain of desperate gambles. But it was better than surrender. He made his decision. First step, pretend to comply. He adjusted his course slightly and followed the lead Yak toward the Soviet airfield. The Soviet pilots relaxed. They had seen this before. Eventually, every intercepted Allied pilot accepted reality. 30 seconds passed. Then 40. The airfield grew larger ahead. 2 minutes away. The lieutenant suddenly pulled both throttles fully back. At the same instant, he dropped full flaps. The P-38 shuddered violently. Airspeed collapsed. The nose pitched upward. Every instinct screamed at him to add power. He ignored it. The Yak fighters reacted instantly. The lead aircraft shot forward. 2 wing escorts blasted past him. The fighters behind swerved violently to avoid collision. For 3 seconds, the sky erupted into confusion. The Lightning hung in the air, trembling on the edge of stall. The control stick shook in his hands. Airspeed fell through 90 knots. Then 80. The aircraft began to mush through the sky. Now, he shoved the nose down. Flaps up. both throttles forward. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then the turbochargers caught. The engines roared back to life. The P-38 plunged downward. 40 degrees. 50. Gravity dragged the aircraft through 200 knots. Above him, the Soviet fighters scrambled to reorganize. But he was already gone. 30 feet above the ground. Full throttle. Heading west. The Yaks recovered quickly and dove after him. But he had gained 6 precious seconds. And gravity had given him speed. 260 knots. 280. The ground blurred beneath the aircraft. Trees and farmhouses flashed past like shadows. 9 fighters chased him. They were faster in level flight. But he wasn't flying level. He skimmed the earth at the edge of control, exploiting ground effect for every possible knot of speed. His fuel gauge dropped again. 3 minutes. The Adriatic was still 30 miles away. The P-38's engine screamed at war emergency power. Temperature gauges crept into the red. He ignored them. Behind him, the Yaks continued their pursuit. They flew carefully. No wild maneuvering. They understood the situation. He was burning fuel. They had reserves. Time favored them. He held the aircraft 30 feet above the ground. Lower wrist clipping a wingtip. Higher meant losing speed. His fuel dropped again. 2 minutes. Maybe 90 seconds. Ahead lay nothing but open farmland. No cover. No escape. The math still didn't work. But the maneuver had bought him time. First 6 seconds. Then 30. Now nearly 2 minutes. Enough to get closer to the coast. Close enough that ditching might be survivable. The Soviet fighters remained a quarter mile behind him. Closing slowly. They maintained distance. Flying this low at such speed was dangerous. One mistake meant death. The lieutenant realized something. He could not outrun them. Could not outturn them. Could not climb away. The only variable left was fuel. Unless he stopped using his. The idea formed instantly. Cut the engines before they died. Glide. The P-38 could glide roughly 9 miles for every mile of altitude. From 30 feet, that meant nothing. But if he climbed first, converted speed into altitude, he could stretch the distance. He checked the fuel gauge. 45 seconds. Maybe 30. The engines could fail at any moment. He pulled back on the controls. The Lightning's nose climbed sharply. Airspeed dropped. Altitude climbed. The Yak fighters reacted instantly, climbing to follow. They assumed he was preparing for a glide. At 900 feet, he rolled the aircraft upside down and pulled through a reverse split S. The P-38 dove directly toward the pursuing fighters. For half a second, he faced 9 Soviet aircraft head-on. They scattered instantly. 3 broke left. 4 broke right. 2 climbed sharply upward. He rolled upright and dove through the gap. Full throttle. 10 seconds. 15. Then the right engine coughed. Fuel starvation. The left engine followed seconds later. Silence filled the cockpit. Both propellers windmilled uselessly. The Lightning was now a glider. Altitude, 1,200 feet. Airspeed, 200 knots. He pulled gently upward, converting speed into altitude. Then trimmed the aircraft for glide. 140 knots. Behind him, the Soviet fighters regrouped and circled. Watching, the American fighter was finished. A powerless aircraft drifting west. They followed from a distance, waiting for the crash. But the lieutenant kept gliding. West, toward the Adriatic. Water flooded the cockpit as the P-38 slammed into the Adriatic. The lieutenant released his harness, kicked free, and fought his way out as the aircraft sank into the shallow water behind him. He waded to the rocky beach, shaking from cold and exhaustion. When he looked back, only the Lightning's twin-tail booms remained above the surface. 3 hours later, Yugoslav partisans found him and helped guide him west through the hills, avoiding German patrols and Soviet checkpoints. After 4 nights of travel, they reached the coast where a Royal Navy boat carried him back to Italy. During debriefing, intelligence officers asked how he escaped 9 Soviet fighters. He explained the maneuver calmly. Cut the throttle, force the stall, let them overshoot, then dive. The story spread quietly among pilots. Some later tried the same desperate trick when Soviet fighters intercepted them. A few died attempting it. Others survived. The lieutenant never used the maneuver again. Years later, he would say it wasn't bravery. It was simply physics, and the refusal to surrender his last option.